Hey YouTube, Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. As you can tell, I'm on the road right now. Apologies for the somewhat janky setup. I actually got married this weekend, so I'm recording this right before I head back to go to the airport to make my way to Austin. Got a great episode today, though. Recorded this before the wedding, slightly off the clock right now. I interviewed Robert Kaplan about his new book, The Loom of Time. We're discussing a region he calls the Greater Middle East, stretching from China to the Mediterranean. We can maybe think that we've moved past the Middle East and with the war in Ukraine and the focus on Europe, but importantly, Robert really puts forth some really interesting ideas around how this region is going to be center geopolitics for the next several decades. So we'd love to know what you think about this conversation and hope you check out his books as well. Robert Kaplan, welcome to the Realignment.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's great to chat with you. You've released two really interesting books this year. We're going to go in reverse order, starting with The Loom of Time, which is out now, given when we're publicizing this episode. But I also would like to discuss The Tragic Mind as well. Let's just kind of get started by placing you. A couple guests, Bridge Colby and Evan Thomas, have actually brought you up on episodes we've done recently. So I think listeners will have heard your name before. But just kind of looking you up, you've been described as a realist when it comes to foreign policy, a term which I think for most people has taken on particular significance after Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the debates about how the West should respond. So how would you define realism in your approach?
Well, in my approach, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be here with you. In my approach, I'm a realist in the internationalist sense. In other words, I look up to people like Henry Kissinger and James Baker and George Shultz, people who believed in internationalism, who were engaged in the world, but at the same time understood that there were limits. Things that we couldn't do. The United States simply couldn't impose its system of governance everywhere in the world. What's happened actually since the Iraq War is that realism has taken on a sort of neo-isolationist tinge, which I'm uncomfortable with. It's sort of, we shouldn't be involved in any of these places. We shouldn't be involved in Ukraine or anything like that. That's wrong. That's not my realism. My realism is that of the Cold War, where America had national interests. It did not seek to impose or spread democracy everywhere, but yet was deeply engaged in all the continents in the world. So I'm sort of like, given today's realism, the post-Iraq war realism, I'm sort of half a realist. In other words, I support the Biden administration in Ukraine. I think it's, despite all the criticism it's been getting, it's basically played it right down the middle. In the sense it's engaged, it's sending tens of billions of dollars in weaponry. It's the greatest demonstration of U.S. power abroad since the first Gulf War of 1990, 1991. And yet at the same time, there are limits. They're not giving the Ukrainians everything they want. They're constantly afraid of this, of a war with NATO, of the use of weapons of mass destruction, etc. So that's the kind of realist I am. And I think that comes through in this new book that I've done, which is about the Greater Middle East.
Yeah, and I think the test case here, because in many ways the kind of moderate realism you're advocating for is one that basically anyone on the face of it, if you're a policymaker, is going to adapt. I'm realistic. I understand there are limits. The test case is how you actually define those limits. So maybe contextualize this in the case of the Greater Middle East, or even Europe broadly, because you brought up Ukraine. What is something that in a perfect world you would like the United States to be able to do, but there's just a limit on it that we cannot do?
I would like the United States in a perfect world to be able to usher in democracy in most places. However, it is not a perfect world. The Arabian Gulf, for instance, is composed of absolute monarchies where, believe it or not, there is a social contract with the population. The absolute monarchies, provide stable, efficient, talented governance and predictable changes of power when a leader dies. And in return, the people do not challenge the ruler. And that has led to decades of stability and prosperity, in the Persian Gulf, in Saudi Arabia, elsewhere. It's not a perfect world. So the United States simply cannot see, by trying to impose democracy everywhere, what we're really saying is our historical experience is more important than yours. So take what we have to offer you, and that's wrong. The historical experience of whatever country you're talking about, in this book, Ethiopia, Egypt, elsewhere, is more important for itself than America's historical experience. So in a perfect world, yes, but in most places, it's a matter of a social contract between ruler and ruled, and that's not always democratic.
Coming off of the end of the 20-year U.S. presence in Afghanistan, and obviously the broader backlash against interventionist foreign policy after the Iraq War, this is easily a time where it's easy for us to say, hey, we're going to prioritize democracy promotion just far less than we were before. We're going to focus on stability, those different aspects. But as you know, we consistently kind of swing in different directions. So during the Jimmy Carter administration, there's a debate about human rights and how much that matters for U.S. foreign policy. How do you understand these swings between whether policymakers think this is something we should prioritize and something we shouldn't prioritize, especially given that you're writing about these countries based on your time on the ground?
First of all, the swings are worse now than they used to be. The swings between George W. Bush and Obama, Obama to Donald Trump, Trump to President Joe Biden, these are extreme swings. During the Cold War, there was much more unanimity between presidential administrations. Yes, the Carter administration emphasized human rights, but it was basically building on what the Nixon and Ford administrations was able to do with the Helsinki process for human rights in communist Eastern Europe. And the Carter administration still, at the end of the day, raised the defense budget. At the time, it seemed like a big swing. But when we look back upon it, the stability or the similarities between Ford, Carter, Reagan were much greater than the similarities of our recent presidents. And I think that's because the Cold War basically inculcated a discipline on presidential administrations, which was lost after the Cold War ended.
Yeah, and this is kind of a helpful way of kind of getting at the big narrative question here. How does the realism you opened with, your focus on the greater Middle East, which obviously it'd be great to get a definition of what that term means, obviously. How does that understanding of those two concepts help you kind of offer a narrative frame for interpreting the world right now? Because once again, to your point, the Cold War is great. Not the Cold War is great, but there's a frame. There's an understanding. And with understanding, you could have continuity between administrations.
All right, let's define the greater Middle East as I do so in the book. It starts in Greece and ends in China, because it starts not between Christianity and Islam, but between Eastern Orthodox Christianity and Western Catholicism. So it starts in Greece and it ends in what the Chinese call Xinjiang province, but which is really East Turkestan, part of the greater Turkic world. That's why I start the book in Western China. And it includes, much of the Arab world, the Persian world, the Turkic world. I include Ethiopia because Ethiopia has had a long tradition of involvement with the Arabian Peninsula, the northern half of Ethiopia. The languages are similar to Hebrew and Arabic. So I throw that in, but I don't include Israel and Palestine. So it's a strange book in a way, because Israel is sort of a cultural outlier in the region. And the theme of the book is about governance. It's not really about geopolitics. It's about governance. Not the split between democracy and authoritarianism. That's our obsession. That's America's obsession. It's the split between the legacy of empire in this region and anarchy, and coming up with some middle of the road formula that essentially provides some sort of acceptable consultative solution for ruler and ruled. And Israel has found that middle road. Democracy, it doesn't work well, as we've seen in recent weeks and months, but it's there. It's a system. In all the other countries that I deal with, it's unclear what the system should be or how it could evolve. And so I'm deliberately on the ground being a reporter in places that are very different from each other. Turkey is very different from Egypt. Egypt is very different from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is very different from Iraq and Syria and all. So that's how I define it. When we talk about empire, most people think, the evil crimes of the Western European imperialists, the British and the French. But I'm talking about empire as something much older, going back to the Umayyad dynasty in Syria in the 7th century that essentially governed from Morocco to almost to India in a way, like a fourth the circumference of the earth. And the Abbasid dynasty based in Baghdad, which governed a similar, vast space of area, and the Hafsids and the Fatimids, and of course the Ottoman Empire, which governed most of the Middle East for 400 years, more than 400 years. And the British and French only come in toward the end of this story. And then, of course, there's the U.S. and the Soviets, which were empires in all but name. I argue in the book.
And this is where I think this kind of coalesces together. You write in the book literally that the broader Middle East has not found a solution to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire a little over a century ago. And it seems like, if we're looking back the past 20 years, democracy promotion was a solution to that issue in terms of like what could it be thought of as like a frame or a solution to that broader problem. How would you kind of assess the status quo in the Middle East then?
Well, look, as I say to people, show me one country in the greater Middle East where democracy has succeeded. For a while, people argued, look at Tunisia, but Tunisia slid back into autocracy. You can't really say any country. It's the Arab Spring failed in Yemen, it failed in Libya, it failed in Tunisia so far. It failed in Egypt. It failed in Syria. There's no place where democracy is taken hold. You do, the closest really is Ethiopia, but that's not part of the Arab Spring. You see, and Ethiopia is tremendously unstable with a recent war that, where hundreds of thousands of people were driven from their homes. And again, as I said earlier, there's the whole Arabian Gulf, which is stable, which has had peaceful transitions of power, rising living standards without democracy.
Where does Turkey fit into this?
Well, Turkey's an interesting case. Remember, Turkey is partly European. It's a member of NATO. That's not an accident. Turkey's secular system was founded by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk after World War I. And Ataturk took Turkey dramatically to the West culturally. He Latinized the alphabet. He tore the veil off women and a lot of other things he did. Then Turkey started moving back towards Islam, especially under the rule of Turgut Özal in the 1980s and early 1990s. Now, we've had in power for 20 years Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who's really Islamicized Turkey and has really eroded many of the democratic safeguards. So that, as Turk said to me, they said, imagine if Donald Trump had been president for 20 years. What would be the state of the State Department, the Justice Department, the CIA? And America has much stronger institutions than even Turkey. So Erdogan has really changed things a lot. Turkey is technically a democracy, but it's a functionally illiberal quasi-autocracy. The question is, where does it go from here? Because Erdogan is not getting any younger. And there's really, I think, two choices. Because he's done so much damage to institutions, Turkey, after Erdogan, could be in a Weimar situation, like Weimar Germany between the end of World War I and the coming to power of Hitler. That is a very weak system that was constantly on edge. Or it could revert back to real democracy, under a new leader. It's unclear. It's the wild card is all the damage that Erdogan has done to the independence of institutions. And that's very hard to calculate how that will affect Turkey in a post-Erdogan future.
And I'm curious then, you also write in the book, though, that at a broader regional level, political Islam is kind of suffering from a lack of enthusiasm. So it's interesting that Turkey has obviously moved in a much more a less secular direction. Yet you're referencing Iran in the case of the political Islamic project. Bring that into this then.
Yeah. Actually, Iran is in a way the most optimistic part of my book, because I'm saying in the second half of the Iran chapter that Iran really could be a democracy. It's much more developed, institutionalized, and sophisticated than many parts of the Arab world. It's Persian. It has all the building blocks of democracy. And political Islam is dead in Iran. Nobody takes it seriously. The government is hated. The government is like a bunch of North Koreans who happen to be ruling a country of South Koreans, So while we associate Iran with extremist Islam, the actual 83 or 84 million Iranian citizens they're fed up with that. And so, it's time for us to start to imagine a post-clerical Iran, an Iran beyond the Ayatollahs. Just like in the 1970s, people should have started imagining an Iran after the Shah. Now we should start to imagine a world beyond the Ayatollahs, because 85 million Iranians, all literate, unleashed, could be the next big addition to globalization and investment. And I think we're going to see something like that in the coming decade.
I'm curious, and this is where the question of whether regime type matters is significant. Obviously, the United States and plenty of Gulf countries have serious regional problems with Iran. Do you think a post-clerical Iran has some of the same similar touch points? Are they still supporting Assad? Is there a rivalry with Saudi Arabia? How should we think about that?
A post-clerical Iran will change its foreign policy. A post-clerical Iran will, I think, it depends what kind of post-clerical Iran. You could have a post-clerical Iran with the Revolutionary Guard ruling things, and that would still be an equally anti-Western and adventurous foreign policy, but with more freedoms for Iranians to dress as they wish, etc., inside their country. But a truly post-clerical Iran could stop interfering in Iraqi political affairs and lead to finally to democratic stability in Iraq. Post-clerical Iran could be less hostile to Israel, more friendly to the Arabian Gulf countries. A real change in leadership in Iran could change the Middle East more than anything that we may do or the Chinese may do, etc.
And I guess this is where the realism comes about. Is this essentially a story that has to have nothing to do with the United States then, in terms of whether we transition to a post-clerical Iran?
Well, in the book, one of the themes is the emergence of China in the greater Middle East. The book begins with China, it ends with China. And everywhere China is involved, not just buying so much oil and gas from Iran and Saudi Arabia, but putting tens of billions of dollars in investment in Egypt and other places. And I think at the beginning of the Biden administration, they thought that they could de-emphasize the Middle East and pay attention to other parts of the world. That's changed. The Biden administration is fearful of China in the Middle East, finally. And that's the real impetus of why the administration is trying to forge some sort of an arrangement between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Because they saw how China had essentially finessed a resumption of diplomatic relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. The Biden administration does not want to be left out. It wants its own, it wants its own geopolitical formula to go along with that. But still, one of the contentions of the book is, even if those things happen, is that we're finally in a post-imperial Middle East. All the empires I mentioned earlier in our conversation are gone. The Americans and the Soviets are not, the Americans are not as intrusive as they used to be everywhere. And Putin has his own problems with Ukraine, and outside of Syria or some other places, the Russians are not as effective throughout the region as the Soviets were during the Nasser period and the Cold War. So it's this post-imperial Middle East that has to find a way for itself, essentially, without having some sort of order imposed by outside powers.
And this kind of raises the other big concept in the book's title, which is just anarchy. Anarchy as this other end of the spectrum from empire.
Right. Yeah. I see anarchy and empire as two extremes, and the idea is to find something in the middle. So it may be democratic, it may not be, but some sort of governance in the middle that gives people dignity. Some feeling of dignity. And anarchy is downplayed by Western elites because they've never experienced it. They know all about dictators. They write all the time about the evils of dictators and authoritarianism, but anarchy is very abstract to them. But for instance, Egyptians, during a year and a half or so after the downfall of Hosni Mubarak in 2011, experienced a form of anarchy. And that's why when Abdel Fattah al-Sisi took power as the new dictator, for the first year or two, he had a honeymoon, because even liberal, Egyptian elites were so terrified at what had happened under the Muslim Brotherhood that they gave a kind of honeymoon to the new military regime in Egypt. Now that's passed. That's passed, but it was very real for a time. And anarchy is always at the edges. I've experienced anarchy in Iraq, in parts of Africa, in other places, and I can tell you, as bad as tyranny is, anarchy is worse.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about that anecdote, because I think you illustrate this dilemma of Western elites through your own engagement and experience of Iraq. Like in the 1980s, you're seeing Iraq at peak tyranny, which then leads to your position in favor of the Iraq War. But then obviously 2003 to 2006, you experience anarchic Iraq. Talk about this through that experience.
Yeah, yeah. Saddam Hussein was not just a dictator. To call him a dictator is to miss the whole point. He was an absolute Stalinist totalitarian, like the regime in North Korea, like the regime in Romania under Ceausescu. Or like the Soviet Union in the 1930s during the Stalinist purge trials. So to experience that on the ground, as I did firsthand in the 1980s during a number of visits, was mind-blowing. I couldn't imagine anything worse. What could be worse than this? Nothing could be worse than this. So that's what led me to support the Iraq War. Then I went back to Iraq as an embedded journalist in 2004 and in 2005, and I actually experienced something even worse, which was total anarchy. And that had a powerful effect on me. People say things like, well, Iraq has held elections. I say, what does it take? 9 months to form a government after the elections? Does electricity work? Does the water work? It's easy to make abstract statements about democracy from 6,000 miles away. But to actually experience how it wasn't working, how it was completely anarchic, is life-changing. Iraq was not an abstraction for me ever, under both Saddam's tyranny and under anarchy.
I think the question that kind of comes to mind as you're describing this, we focused on a lot of countries that listeners are probably aware of, but as is clear in your book, you were writing about Western China and the Uyghurs in the 1990s, and your editor was kind of like skeptical of that topic. And obviously, you famously were writing about the Balkans in the 80s before that became a centerpiece of 1990s foreign policy. Of all of the different countries and experiences you've had across the greater Middle East, could you kind of take, I don't want to say a bet or a prediction because people hate those, but like, where do you think is a place that our listeners have probably not heard of, but in the 2030s, 2040s, they're going to say, oh, I wish I maybe spent more time thinking about this region or this country?
Well, I would say Iran, first of all, to repeat myself, because I think Iran's going to be very different, maybe 180 degrees different by the 2030s and the 2040s than it is now. And it will be a real hub of global investment in places. I think Turkey, too, because I think Turkey will recover from the Erdogan era. The other countries I don't know about. The real question in the Arabian Peninsula is, can these countries make the conversion to a post-oil and gas era while still remaining prosperous and stable? And so far, the chances are not too badly, because they've actually been aware of this problem for many years and that's why Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, the head of Saudi Arabia, why he gave a lot more freedom to women, why he basically was a quiet supporter of the Abraham Accords. All this had to do with one thing: making Saudi society more entrepreneurial, bringing women into the workforce, having deals with Israel, all to make Saudi Arabia able to sustain a post-hydrocarbon future, so to speak. Tunisia may actually recover from its current bout with autocracy and go back to being a stable democracy like Spain or Portugal. And I say this because Tunisia has only about 10 million people. It has no great ethnic splits or sectarian splits. It's not regionally divided with great mountain ranges like Yemen or places like that. It's close to Europe. It's very, very close and integrated with Europe. It probably has the best chance of any place out there. But I think elsewhere, you can elsewhere the problem is basic. It's order. It's how do we create a new order without order being so oppressive, and what I look at is not bringing democracy to the Middle East, but bringing more consultative governments like in Morocco, Oman, and Jordan to the Middle East. Because with the exception of empires, the most natural form of governance in the Middle East has been monarchies. That's something people don't want to, Americans don't want to hear, but that happens to be true.
So the last question before we transition to a final section on The Tragic Mind, your other release, is you quote a Belgian politician back in 2019 saying that the current era will not be about countries and nations. It's going to be about empires. And I actually really kind of didn't understand that quote, just in the sense that so many of the ways that we understand this present moment, especially after Brexit, has been it's the nation state. It's not international institutions. It's not regionalism. Could you help me understand that quote?
Yeah. First of all, I think that was in a footnote. So you
It
really
was in a
read it
footnote.
closely.
Yeah.
You really read the book closely. It was Guy Verhofstadt, a former Belgian prime minister, I think, who said that. What he was actually referring to in a way is, see, in other writings of mine, I've defined the European Union as imperial. In the sense that it's governed from far, government by bureaucrats in faraway Brussels determines the diets and a lot of the regulations of places like Greece and Bulgaria at the other end of Europe. So that the European Union is sort of a benign empire. In that sense, in the way that the Habsburg Empire was benign and the Ottomans were benign in many ways. And what he meant was that China was always an empire. Russia is rediscovering its imperial roots, getting involved in Ukraine, etc. The European Union, has this imperial tinge to it. If you replace empire in his statement with like great power, the movements of great powers with their allies and everything, I think it becomes understandable.
Yes, that's very helpful. So, okay, last real section on The Tragic Mind. What does it mean to think tragically? It's kind of like you raised this at the beginning of the book, and that's the most helpful way to frame it.
Yeah, sure. Tragedy is not common misfortune, which we all go through and which is part of life. Common misfortune is the rule of life. Tragedy is not the triumph of evil over good, because that's actually a clear-cut issue. Tragedy is the competition of one good over another good that causes suffering. It's about the narrow choices we face, however vast the landscape. Tragedy is Agamemnon, the Greek tribal leader, having to choose between literally physically sacrificing his daughter at the altar to get the support of his forces who demand the death of his daughter to favor the gods. It means doing that or not doing that and losing power, and his whole family may be losing their life. It's all about narrow binary choices. Tragedy is when a leader has to make the binary choice of to invade or not to invade, even though he may have only 30% of the evidence about what's actually going on the ground in the place where he wants to invade. In other words, the situation is given to mysteries. It's very subtle, but he will be judged by a binary choice of doing either or. And this occurs in democratic administration countries too, not always with war and peace, but with taking various decisions. I mean, I think every day the president of the United States is faced with a number of choices, a number of options, and none of them are good. But, he's got to do something. It's about the absence of purely good options, because even if he takes the best option, it's still going to cause this suffering at some level among some part of the constituency. Um, and tragedy is also realizing that the world is imperfect and is beautiful at the same time. There was a great American classicist in the early mid 20th century, Edith Hamilton, who said that not to think tragically is sordid. It's to rob life of its significance. So that's the sense of tragedy that I explore in this other book.
And I guess to your point about thinking tragically, I said this to you before the recording started, but I found this book just so helpful because it helped me just kind of think about things. How do you think a tragic mindset? Because I like to think about this in terms of George W. Bush. It's September 11th, 2001. So how would a tragic mindset or the ability to think that way when necessary, how could that have informed? Can't predict the choices he makes, but how could that have informed the way a president would approach a catastrophic situation like that?
Yeah. Well, it's like this. I think, let me switch to Biden for a second. Biden was informed that the Russians really invaded Ukraine. They actually did it, opened up a 600-mile front with 3 or 4 tank brigades and prongs. And he had to make a decision. And people were saying Ukraine's not that important. It's not like East Asia where America has all these economic importance. No, Biden decided he would help the Ukrainians almost to the limit, but the word almost is crucial there. He wouldn't give them everything they wanted. He wouldn't, he would always be afraid of the war spreading to NATO. He thought tragically. He may not be able to intellectualize that, but that's what he did. In terms of George W. Bush, he had to respond to 9/11 because 9/11 was the greatest attack on U.S. soil since Pearl Harbor. He couldn't not do anything. And given that the terrorists were based in Afghanistan, people forget this now, but the Bush administration gave the Taliban government several options to arrest bin Laden and all this. It wasn't just we're going to invade Afghanistan. But with the Taliban government not doing anything, they felt they had to do it. Invading Iraq was a harder choice than people imagine because although Saddam was not supporting Al-Qaeda, he was supporting almost every other terrorist group in the Middle East. And he wouldn't let the UN inspectors in. So there was there were reasons. But I think at the end of the day, I think the younger Bush administration did not think sufficiently tragically when it came to deciding on war in Iraq.
Another word that comes up in the book is what one fears and the fear of being wrong about something. What is something looking out in the next few years that you're afraid you could be wrong about?
Well, first of all, what I meant was that we should husband fear. We should celebrate. It's good to be afraid because many of the things we're afraid of don't actually happen because we take decisions to kind of mitigate the danger, so to speak. It's the things we don't even think about that tend to happen to us. When you think about life, this is what it is. So fear is a good thing, but you should never be immobilized about fear, so to speak. I think the thing that some of the things that I always fear as an analyst that you could be wrong, but at the same time, you have to go with what you see and hear on the ground, and what you read. I think the thing that I fear is that Egypt may be in for some really tough times. Because the current dictatorship has no answers, essentially, to Egypt. And the population grows, the water resources get smaller and smaller. So I think I worry about Egypt. I worry that the clerical regime in Iran may find a way to hold on to power. just may find a way to hold on to power. I wonder about Tunisia just slipping into permanent dictatorship, so to speak, of Libya not coming back together. But the overall theme of my book I would call tepidly optimistic, because the very term loom of time, and I explain it early in the book what it means, it's about progress, but progress not in a linear direction, in a very, things don't happen in a straight line. There are all these zigs and zags. And if we think that you could have more open regimes in a number of these countries, though not necessarily according to the Western definition of democracy, you can be somewhat optimistic.
So for these last three questions, back to your fear point, I liked your quote when you said, fear is the only way to escape ambition. Can you explain that quote?
Yeah, I think people in Washington, Washington's a place of ambition, and it's through ambition that we shape and improve the world. So it's good to be ambitious, it's but what I meant was that when you're too ambitious, you're not fearing enough, you're not afraid enough, because it often happens that what people want they get, and then they're destroyed by it, so to speak. Everyone wants this job in the Pentagon, and then there's a war that goes badly and their careers are ruined forever. So I think by being wary, by being afraid, you could kind of temper your ambition.
And then to kind of contextualize it for folks, you said that the Eisenhower administration did a great job of balancing fear and ambition together.
Yes, in certain cases. Remember when Eisenhower was the first U.S. president who had many hydrogen bombs at his disposal and never used them, even though his advisors had, raised the possibility of him using nuclear weapons on two offshore islands off China, Quemoy and Matsu, even though
That's the original Taiwan crisis, right?
Right. Yeah. That's the original Taiwan crisis, or one of them. The original was upended by the Korean War. It goes back a bit further. But then also, Eisenhower is advised to intervene in Hungary when the Soviets put down the Hungarian Revolution in 1956. He chose not to. Eisenhower was a very cautious president because he was very afraid of nuclear war. And he didn't want, he really, because in the 50s, most people assumed that at some point these weapons will be used, because everything was new in the 50s. It was the beginning of the Cold War. Both sides had developed these weapons, and weapons that are developed had always been used in the past. So there was this tremendous fear. And Eisenhower, through his caution, he didn't intervene in Vietnam in a big way after the French had lost the Dien Bien Phu. So it was, Eisenhower's caution that not only preserved world peace, but also set a means of behavior for other presidents throughout the Cold War in terms of not using nuclear weapons.
And to wrap, a quote that I think actually I'm going to put on my mental wall as a means of judging folks. You say that the first thing you want to do is look at someone's ability to make judgment in crisis rather than just looking at their resume. This goes to your point about DC people moving up and up, driven by ambition. Focus on character and judgment. So two-part question to finish. One, how does one assess character and judgment? Like when you're doing that interview and you aren't just looking at the resume. But two, how does one then develop character and judgment if you're on the other end of that side?
I think people develop judgment by being wrong and making mistakes. Because they never make the same mistake a second time. They make new mistakes. That's normal. That's very normal. What's dangerous is people who have always been right on everything, because then they don't fear enough. They think they have some omnipotent power. Someone like Robert Gates was, I think, a great Secretary of Defense because he had held all these smaller positions in government going back decades and had seen it all, seen people make mistakes, seen all this. So he came to the office in a way humble. He saw how easy it was to misjudge things. And as a result, I think he did a very good job. Had Gates come to power as Secretary of Defense in 2004 rather than 2006, at the beginning of the younger Bush's second administration, rather than in the middle of it, we may look at the Iraq War differently than we do now. Because a lot of the bad things that happened in that bracket between 2004 and 2006 when Rumsfeld was still the Secretary of Defense.
That is a really helpful place to end. Robert, this has been really great. Could you just shout out the Loom of Time for folks who want to check it out?
Yeah, The Loom of Time Between Empire and Anarchy from the Mediterranean and China. It's a book of travel, memoir, reporting, geopolitics, and other things about the greater Middle East. It's a generalist book. It's not a restrictive kind of, book on one country or a political science book on one country. It's about a whole region from, taking into account many different disciplines.
Excellent. Thank you for joining me on the Realignment.
Thank you for having me.